Okay, we're ready to go this morning. I'm going to start with a Bible question that comes up quite often when people ask me different things. This is one that I would say comes up about once every year or so. What does the term divine providence of God mean? Well, divine providence, in a very narrow sense of the word, refers to the sovereignty of God. Divine providence asserts that God, with wisdom and love, cares for and directs all things. This teaching that we are talking about here on divine providence is in direct opposition to the human philosophy that says whatever happens, happens. And we can't do anything about it. That's called fate and is not a biblical concept. There's a great musical song called the Magnificat. People who are familiar with music know this quite well. This is Mary's song of praise that comes up in Luke's Gospel, the first chapter, and it teaches us a very important aspect of the divine providence of God. Mary is rejoicing in this song and praising the greatness of God, who sent the angel Gabriel to share God's plan, which tells us that he had a plan. It was not just something that was an accident, what came about with Mary, and that she would give birth to the Christ child. So what does the Bible say specifically about this subject? Well, I'll give you a few verses here. Jesus teaches us that God is sovereign over the physical world. This comes up in Matthew's Gospel, the 5th chapter, and Jesus says this, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so therefore, Jesus is attributing the sun rising and the rain falling to God. The psalmist in the Old Testament tells us that the providence of God influences the affairs of nations. In Psalm 66 it says this, He rules forever by His power, His eyes watch the nations. Let not the rebellious rise up against Him. The providence of God influences our human destiny, according to the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 1. But when God, who had chosen me and set me apart before I was born and called me through His grace, was pleased. So, what should we believe exactly after talking about this for a couple of minutes and reading these scriptures? The primary means by which God accomplishes His will is most often through secondary causes. In other words, the laws of nature and human choice. God, however, will sometimes work directly to accomplish His will, and we call those acts miracles. We know now also that humans have a free will. But we also know that God is sovereign. We've already established that. So how do we reconcile those two together? Well, I'll be frank with you, these truths relate to each other, but they're very hard to understand exactly how they work. But we can see some examples of how it works in the Scripture. The most glaring and most important example, I think, is God's providence at work in the life of Judas Iscariot. God allowed Judas to lie, to deceive, to cheat, to steal, and betray Jesus because it led to a greater good that God had in His plan. Jesus had to die at the hands of the Romans in order to become the sacrifice for sin. We know that. So God providentially allowed Judas, through his free will, to perform a series of acts of sin. Now, this that I just shared with you is confirmed by Jesus himself in the 22nd chapter of Luke. So here's a biblical truth I think we take from this as we try to apply this lesson to our everyday life. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The providence of God. Now we move into today's lesson and talk about the purpose for this lesson. It is to understand that even though we are one of God's people, we may sometimes find that we are involved in a situation where the circumstances in our life are just simply out of control. We don't know what to do. Here's a practical principle to think about in that regard. We've been through this ourselves in the last year. We must remember that when we encounter a difficult situation, it does not mean that things are out of control and hopeless because he is not aware of or is uninterested in our situation. It's very easy to wonder in the midst of a crisis like the COVID pandemic that we have been through, where is God in all of this? What's his role in this? Is he just allowing us to make it the best way we can, or does he have some involvement? We can apply that thought like this. It's important, I think, for us to remember that when we're in the midst of a crisis and feel helpless about the situation, it is time for us to remember who we are. As God's covenant people, that's an important distinction for Christians to remember, that we are God's covenant people. That means that he loves us. He has made a promise to us to love us, protect us, and care for us. And we must stand firm on that belief and trust in his sovereignty, even though we don't see it in action sometimes. The failure to turn to God in prayer, both personal prayer and corporate prayer as a church, concerning a crisis like the COVID pandemic that we've been through, may represent, on the part of some, a lack of trust and unbelief, really, in God's sovereignty. Now we talk about our lesson scripture today, and I will introduce some of the characters of this lesson. This is from the Old Testament, of course, and it's from the book of Esther. So the first question we have is, who exactly is Esther? Why is she in the Old Testament? Why is she important? The time period for this lesson is 474 BC. So Esther now was a young Jewish woman who was raised by her older cousin, a man named Mordecai, and improbably, but providentially, because of her astonishing beauty, became the queen to the king of the Persian Empire, Ahasuerus. So, who was Mordecai? Well, Mordecai was a Jew. That right there proves that your teacher is not perfect, because those words are not supposed to be there. They're supposed to be up on the top part of that slide. So you can go home and say, I saw him make a mistake this week. Mordecai was a Jew who lived in Susa, which was the capital of Persia, and had responsibility for what is known as the city gates. His great-grandfather and his grandfather had been taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar when they captured and eliminated the northern kingdom of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. Mordecai acted as a father and raised this Jewish young girl named Hadassah, which her name means myrtle tree, if that's of interest to you in Hebrew, whose parents had died. Well, we're supposed to be studying Esther, so where did Hadassah come from? Her name was changed to Esther to hide her identity when she became the queen of Persia. They didn't want her to be known as a Jew. Mordecai acted as a father and raised this Jewish young girl, Hadassah, whose parents had died. Her name was changed to Esther, as we said, to hide her identity when she became the queen of Persia. Now, there's another character in this story that's very important that we know who he was. His name is Haman. Haman had a prominent office in the kingdom of Persia and had an intense hatred for Mordecai because he refused to bow to him in honor of him in his position. So he would be like the vice president, and he would expect everyone to bow and honor him as if he were the president. However, Mordecai refused to bow to him. Mordecai, being a faithful Jew, would only bow to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and never to any human. Haman convinced the king, therefore, to issue a decree to annihilate the Jewish people. That is our story for today. We begin in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, with Mordecai's report on the plot. So Hathak went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Hathak is a eunuch who is a servant of the queen. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction or the killing of all of the Jews. They wanted to eliminate all the Jews in the Persian Empire. This would be similar to the Holocaust that we know about in Germany during the 30s and 40s of 1900. Now, the city gates in that day and time acted as protection, of course, for the people, but the King's Gate was also the primary location where business for transactions, courts to be convened, that sort of thing, public announcements made. This would be like a town square in many situations. Hathak, as I said, was a eunuch who served the queen. Queen Esther's, he was one of her attendants. In that day and time, it was common, if a king had a harem, to have many eunuchs who served that harem. Mordecai told Hathak about the king's decree to kill the Jews and instructs him to ask the queen to intervene with the king on behalf of her people. Verses 8 and 9. He also gives him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation. In other words, to kill all the Jews, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathak went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Now Mordecai had given a copy of the king's decree to Hathak to deliver to the queen and to challenge her to intercede with the king on behalf of her people. Here's something I think is very important to think about right here as part of this lesson study. Mercy is a word that you hear quite a bit. Mercy is God's gift of compassion. It is not necessarily a human attribute that you acquire or you learn through education, etc., or experience. It is a gift from God. The human nature is not to be merciful. The mercy that you experience or that you demonstrate to others is, frankly, a gift of the Spirit of God. Whether the distress is caused by the guilt of sin or any kind of debilitating physical condition. So, the point I want to remember here is that mercy is an expression of God's love. So when you and I demonstrate and show mercy to someone, we are manifesting God's love. That's the way they experience it. One of our roles, therefore, as a disciple, is to be willing to share this spiritual gift of mercy. You've heard a lot about spiritual gifts, I'm sure, but maybe you haven't thought about mercy being one of those gifts. Mercy can be demonstrated with words of encouragement or acts of compassion and sympathy given to someone when God prompts you with His Spirit to interact with that person. In other words, God has people around us, and we are charted on His plan. When He wants His mercy demonstrated to someone, He gives someone else on our earth the assignment. I sent you a video yesterday called tapping on the shoulder. I thought that was a good expression. God taps you on the shoulder sometimes to do something like demonstrating an act of mercy. When that happens, we should be obedient. 10th through the 12th verse. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king, he has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days now have passed since I was called to go to the king. Doesn't exactly indicate they had an intimate relationship, does it? If he goes 30 days without seeing the king, and she is his queen. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, we're going to see what his response was now in a minute. Esther was replying to Mordecai that he was simply asking her to do the impossible, since no one could come before the king unless they were invited. In her heart, she was inclined to help the Jewish people, but if it meant asking and risking her life, she would frankly rather Mordecai find someone else to be the intercessor. That's a pretty common human reaction. When it's hard, when it's difficult, when it's something that seems impossible, our reaction will most often be, oh, God, find somebody else. Call on somebody else. Tap someone else on the shoulder. However, with the empowerment of the Spirit, we can do what we're called to do by God. No question about that. 13th and 14th verse. He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Someone else will carry out God's request. But you and your father's family will perish. You will be killed. Make no mistake about that. And who knows? We're now talking this morning about the providence of God. Here's an important statement in the Scripture. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Do you know how Esther got to be the queen? Well, the story goes like this. The former queen was called to come before the king and all of his dinner partners and do a dance and demonstrate her beauty and her sexual prowess to those who were having dinner with the king. She refused to do it. She said, I'm not doing that. Okay. The king simply said, you're not the queen anymore. I'm going to get a new queen. And so they had a call that went out throughout the land to find the most beautiful woman in the kingdom of Persia who would be the next queen. Guess what? A Jewish girl by the name of Hadassah became the queen because she was selected as the most beautiful woman in the whole kingdom. That's how Esther got to be the queen. These inspired words that we just read teach us the truth about divine providence. God had a plan in arranging the circumstances for a Jewish woman, a Jewish girl, to be selected from all of the kingdom to become the queen. Only God could arrange that. No other human circumstances could have worked that out. So she became Esther, the queen of the Persian Empire. Here's something to think about, I think, right here. God's Spirit will sometimes prompt us to say or do something that we find hard. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I've experienced it personally, and I'm sure you probably have. Also, if you haven't, it's because you just became a Christian this morning. You will, at some point, experience a calling from God when He taps you on the shoulder to do something that is very hard. And you probably would like someone else to do it. It is, however, important to remember that we will never, ever be asked by God to do something based solely on our human strength and ability. He knows what your capabilities are. He knows your intellectual capacity. He knows all about you. He knows more about you than you know about yourself. So therefore, when He gives us an assignment, He knows that He will need to give you the empowerment of the Spirit to complete that. And He is willing to do that. If our heart is willing, then the Spirit will empower us with the words. In other words, He will actually give you the words to say, the words to speak. All you have to do is open your mouth. I have found by experience that that works, that happens. However, it doesn't work if you keep your lips zipped. In other words, if you go in and say, I'm not saying anything, no. Well, then you can't be empowered with the words. However, if you just start talking, God will give you the words. And the way it works is like this. You may say a paragraph of words and sentences, but in that paragraph is something that's very meaningful to the person who's the listener. And that's because God has empowered that sentence or that group of words. He will also empower your actions, things that you do. I have a picture here of a man raking leaves in a yard. Can you imagine a white man going across the street and cutting the grass of a black woman? Very difficult to imagine. However, we know it has happened at Kingswood. And that's why Brenda and her mother became members of Kingswood, because of a faithful soul named Jerry Morris. So the actions that we do are empowered to accomplish God's reason that He gave us the assignment in the first place. He could have given it to anybody, but He chose you. 15th and 17th verse. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. This is a formal Jewish prayer, fasting and praying. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. In other words, go before God and pray for Him to empower me and support me. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Mordecai was inspired with the spiritual wisdom to know that God had raised a little Jewish orphan girl in exile for this occasion. And Esther must have the courage and wisdom to understand God's assignment and to step out in faith and fulfill it. Now, this is a biblical principle that applies to us today. We're reading this Old Testament story, and you say, what can we get from that? Well, we get this principle that is not only true in that day and time, but is still true today. I have an example to show you. This biblical principle applies to us. God puts us in a place for a reason, and we need the courage and wisdom to see what that reason is and to act on it. I'm showing you a picture of a man named Anthony Delgado from Doraville. If you read the enormous, newsworthy Dunwoody Crier, a lot of people think that's a useless piece of paper. However, once in a while they have an interesting story, and this past week they had one that told about Anthony, who was a drug-addicted homeless person living in the Greyhound bus station. And he was approached by what he says were two angels. And they told him to get up and get his life straightened out. And he did. Since he was listening to two angels, the story goes on that he became a Christian and has established a nonprofit organization called I Care for Atlanta. He has 8 employees now, and they pass out food to needy people in Doraville and Chambly. Anthony Delgado. Take a look at his website entitled I Care Atlanta. 5th chapter, 1st verse. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw the queen, Esther, standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So, we should see in this scene, as it plays out, with the understanding that Esther was given the grace of God to look beyond herself and her self-centered fears and concerns about her own life. She was now willing to fulfill the divine purpose, and she was willing by faith to accept whatever outcome God had in mind for her. Remember, she said, if I perish, I perish. But I must do what God has called me to do. When the king saw her, he welcomed her, and she obtained his favor. So God was working in the heart of the king, not only the queen in this story. That favor that the king demonstrated and bestowed on her continues if you read the rest of the chapters of the book of Esther. And we're given then the details of how Haman's evil plot to kill all the Jews unraveled, and eventually he was hung on the gallows that he intended for Mordecai to be hung on. So the genocide of the Jews was averted. As we wrap up this lesson this morning, I have a final thought to share with you. This story has described a very desperate time, to say the least, for God's people, the Jews. They cried out to God with fasting and prayer, and He protected them. It's important for us as Christians to remember that no matter how difficult and how hopeless our circumstances may appear, there is never a time when our situation is so desperate that we are beyond God's love and protection. We must never, ever be deceived into thinking that God will not fulfill His covenant of love with us. A covenant is a promise. God has promised that to us. He's promised to love us. He's demonstrated that by the gift of His Son on the cross, and He will fulfill all of the parts of the promise that are required in our life. He will provide a means of deliverance from any desperate situation that we may experience. And all God's people said,